So, Dr. Wong has asked me to sort of talk to you guys a little bit about visual rhetoric, and so I decided I'd put together a nice little video here to sort of help us illustrate. This would be the PowerPoint I would be giving you guys normally, but let's just talk a little bit about what visual rhetoric is, and since it's something I work with a lot. So my nice little PowerPoint here is: what is visual rhetoric? Do you know? Have you seen it? Please feel free to laugh. Don't have to. All right. So definition, working from how I see it. I'm throwing a lot of puns in here. You don't have to laugh at them, but I find them amusing to write them. So when we define rhetoric in a very much classical originalist kind of sense, most people turn to Aristotle and sort of see it in the idea that it's about persuading an audience. That is what we consider the classical form of rhetoric. It's all about finding the available means of persuasion, and it's all focused a lot on persuasion. Okay. Modern sort of discussions of rhetoric tend to refocus it less on persuasion and rather on seeking to communicate. Okay. This does not mean that we aren't done with persuasion. It's that we're broadening it a little bit to encompass things that aren't necessarily always argumentative or trying to persuade us, even though most of the time that's what everything is trying to do. This, of course, like I said, broadens the place and ubiquity of rhetoric in everything we do. If it has anything to do with communication, then it's everywhere. It's in everything. All right? So if that is rhetoric, then visual rhetoric is about communicating the world today using images and text, and often together or separately. So they can be done either way. And we'll look at a couple examples here. So I like to start with comic books. I deal a lot with comic books and graphic novels, and so I'm going to start here, but this is a form of visual rhetoric, okay? And typically when I go for this, I like to use Scott McCloud, okay? And this is from his work, and in fact, the opening of his book, Understanding Comics. And so he starts here on the left-hand panel, and here's a tip for you guys. If you are approaching a comic book, you read it just like a book. You go left to right, up, down. But interestingly enough, as you move from a panel to panel, you are moving in time and space. So, for example, if people failed to understand comics, it was because they defined what comics could be too narrowly. The proper definition, if we could find one, might give lie to the stereotypes and show that the potential of comics is limitless and exciting. This is where our journey begins. And this is what he goes into in his work, Understanding Comics, is he tries to, using the visual form here, engage his audience in a persuasion about exactly what comic books are, since he kind of comes into this with the idea that most people don't really fully understand them. And so he goes on here. And so he's talking here, look, and this is a great example of visual rhetoric. If you see here, this idea here of here is his figure, and he says the world of comics is a huge and varied one. Notice what he's doing here. Look at the stature of his figure. Look at the big size of this globe, emphasizing the huge. And the varied, if you look at all the individual images, not one of them appears to be exactly the same. He is in fact illustrating the point he is trying to make here with a visual prompt to go along with the dialogue. Okay? And I've done a little splitting up here. So while not being so broad as to include anything which is clearly not comics, comics is a word worth defining as it refers to the medium itself. Okay? So what is comics? He goes back to this term. He even tries to artfully approach the term of sequential art as given to us by Will Eisner, another theorist. But it's worth noting here the difference he establishes between a picture and a comic. And comics tend to be sequenced images, images in sequence. So, for example, I talk about this a lot with my students. If I see this picture of a man here, and I ask you to describe it, you are seeing a man with his hand on his hat. But if I show you this sequence, now it's a man lifting his hat off his head. It becomes slightly different. Okay, it's now communicating something slightly different. This is just simply a picture of a sun. But if I show you the sun and then I show you another image afterwards of it going down, you would say the sun is setting. Here's the other interesting thing. If I flip these images, it becomes the sun rising. Here's a picture of a gun being fired. That's just simply a gun being fired. But if I put in a sequence here and then a woman shrieking, you now would walk away with the meaning that this is not a gun being fired. This is someone being shot, very likely, or being shot at. This one here is a pretty simple one, followed here by a clock and time, and then an eye closing, which you could obviously flip around and make an eye opening. But this is the idea in the power of comics, is this idea of the difference between what these are and what they exist as still images, and what they then exist in as they are placed in sequence. Okay? And then he tries to provide a definition that sort of helps us here. And I'm just going to go over it briefly because I think it's a good thing to understand. He says here, what comics are is juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information and or produce an aesthetic response in the viewer. All right? I'm going to come back to me using that there, but let's back up for a second. So, juxtaposed pictorial and other images. You see these two images standing right next to each other? This is what we mean by juxtaposed. They're side by side in a deliberate sequence. So here's an example. This, by depicting it this way, is a man taking his hat off. If I were to flip the sequence and make it deliberately another way, it would be a man putting his hat on. Okay? In deliberate sequence, and it can be used to convey information, to produce an aesthetic response in the viewer, or it can do both. Okay? That's the and or. And when we say by aesthetic response, what we are referring to is the idea of, do we find it visually pleasing? Okay? Now, getting back to what I said, and what McLeod is doing here is a form of both images and words, along with an avatar of himself, to communicate via visual rhetoric what comics are. That's what he's trying to do here. And I use a very similar approach in my own classroom. You'll see here is my nice little avatar of myself. Comics are a form of visual rhetoric using words and images together to communicate and to persuade. McLeod's own definition here affirms this. As you can see, I chose to use the same method a bit myself in my own classes. So you'll see here, if we just look at his definition, that comics are juxtaposed pictorial images in deliberate sequence intended to convey information or produce an aesthetic response. So they are engaged in a form of communication, visual rhetoric. Okay. Another prominent form of visual rhetoric that most of you are probably familiar with is the meme. Okay. So, but do you know what a meme really is? Okay. I tend to come at the meme as an abbreviation connected to the word enthymeme. Enthymeme is a rhetorical device similar to a logical syllogism. So it says here, an enthymeme represents the form of a logical syllogism, but leaves something out, relying on the audience to fill in something that is left unsaid. Example, here is a meme. Here's an enthymeme. Socrates is mortal because he is human. This is actually playing on a syllogism I want to look at real quickly. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit closer here. Now we have an image, and this is of course Willy Wonka, and this is a popular one that makes its way around, and someone has added the dialogue. It says, here's an enthymeme. And so it's actually presenting you with an enthymeme. The enthymeme is a representation of the syllogism that looks like this. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Now, the form of a syllogism is, if it is tested, it has to be true, then it can be accepted. Otherwise, it's engaged in a logical fallacy. So the first thing you have to do is ask the question. If I were to ask you, are all men mortal? You'd probably say yes, and women too. But we're going with the simple version here. Socrates is a man. To the best of our knowledge, he is. If we accept the two premises, then our conclusion that he is mortal is very likely true. But look at what he wrote instead. He said, here's an enthymeme. Socrates is mortal because he is human. This is a variation. What it has done here is it has kept the minor premise, Socrates is a man, okay? And it has sort of combined this. So Socrates is mortal because he is human. It is actually variation on the two premises here, and then therefore it creates the conclusion, or it leaves the conclusion to your imagination to fill in. Actually, I think more accurately, it's probably accepting the conclusion in the minor premise and then accepting the fact that you have to look for what's not being expressed here. It's really leaving out the major premise. And that's probably because most people would accept that all men are mortal and all women are mortal. I don't think anybody is a vampire. So, now this isn't a direct one this is not a direct one for one, but this is basically what is represented here. And you'll notice that they chose to use the term human rather than mortal or man. They varied up the terms a little bit. Something was left out, and as we just sort of said, I sort of come to the idea that very, very, very much what's being left out here is the major premise. This is the one thing that's not actually expressed, but it's left to you, the audience, to accept it. It's operating under the idea that you accept this as true. Okay? Now, Aristotle discussed enthymemes as well as a means of persuasion. Typically, they're what you're most of the time if you write a thesis statement. That's an enthymeme. It relies on the syllogistic form of a major premise, minor premise, and conclusion. The difference is that it leaves some part of that form out. What is left out is, in fact, left to the audience to fill in. So typically, this is the way why, if you see a lot of political memes, they tend to have different reactions depending on who is reading them. If, say, for example, my political views are, let's say, more conservative, then if you sent me a meme that meant one thing to someone more liberally bent, it would mean something different to me because I would be filling in the gap in a different way than someone who come at it from a liberal point of view and vice versa. And of course, visual rhetoric itself relies a lot on this audience participation. So, what is being left unsaid versus what is being said? I've got two little examples here. Not the greatest example here. You have a picture of Kanye West, makes a song about gold diggers, gets one pregnant. All right. What's being left out here? His relationship with Kim Kardashian as being a gold digger. It's left for you to assume that. And then if any of you are familiar with The Office, this is playing on that term YOLO, and then Dwight going false. A fast ambulance response and a team of good doctors could revive you and live a second time. Making a joke on the idea of you only live once. Visual rhetoric here at work here is the combination of words and images, just like they do in comics. The trick is that something has been left out to the audience to fill in the gap. So if you saw a meme and someone laughs at it, but you don't laugh at it, it's because you obviously were not an intended audience, and very much likely you don't know what was being left out. There's an old one I used to use with my students where if you were familiar with the Thor movies, there's this hammer he uses, and what it actually was an image of, it was a picture, the top picture was actually a picture of Miley Cyrus from that Wrecking Ball video she did years ago, licking the hammer, which is Thor's primary weapon. And then the picture below it was a picture of Thor on his knees reaching up like he was screaming no. Meant to be a joke that, she might necessarily be somebody you want touching your hammer. There's also a second level joke in there in that she was engaged to, broke up with, married, and now got divorced from Chris Hemsworth's brother, and Chris Hemsworth is the actor who played Thor. Now, what memes are typically relying on, that something being left out, is what comic book aficionados like Scott McCloud call the gutter. You'll see here an example of the gutter. Two images. This white space is what we're paying attention to. Okay? The space between the panels, that is what comic aficionados have been termed the gutter. And despite its unceremonious title, the gutter plays a part in the magic and mystery that are at the heart of comics, because what happens here is your mind, just like with a meme filling in something that they think you assume to know, you are left with an example of something where you fill in the gap. So, for example, if I look at this first panel, now you die, this one guy swinging an axe, someone screaming no, no, and then I cut away to the scene, someone screaming in pain, you're very likely going to assume that he hit the man with the axe. Did you see that? No. Your imagination filled it in. Okay? And he says here in the limbo of the gutter, the imagination takes two separate images and transforms them into a single idea. This is what you did. This is also how an enthymeme works, in that you are typically, if you are the correct audience, are able to fill in that gap. Now, the potential of visual rhetoric is vast, and McCloud does a nice job of helping to illustrate that. So you'll see here on the screen, he's visualized the ways we communicate. For example, here is the written word, here is music, here is cinema. They all start with an idea, and they all end with an idea in another person, between two peoples. Now, how do you span this gap? So you'll see here, if I have an idea, I get a pen, I write it down, someone reads it, someone gets the idea. Not typically going to be a direct mind-for-mind switch. We don't have telepathy. Same thing here. Someone has an idea, here's their instrument, they play the music, someone hears it, there's the idea. Now, this transference from brain to brain here isn't going to be 100% of a transference, okay? There's going to be something lost, but it's an attempt to communicate. And here's an example of him using the exact same idea as it applies to comic books as well. Here's another take on the meme that I personally found funny. This was a meme from the American Chopper TV program, but what interestingly enough, someone actually took it and used it as a way to make a meme about memes. So here's that top panel. American Chopper memes are compelling rhetorical devices that could be taught in schools. Here's someone arguing back. They are an impenetrable wall of text only, serving only to exceedingly dry and jokes for the repartee subcultures already familiar with with their subject. So they're already making a criticism here. This idea that the meme can be used something to taught in schools. Someone noting though that the memes are only work on particular audiences. This person, of course, argues back. They are brilliantly employ American Chopper as a lowbrow carrier wave to entice people to read about ideas they otherwise wouldn't. Here's where it escalates. They have none of the brevity and energy of good memes. They are substitute faux academic logorrhea for wit. And then, of course, the final statement. This is the only meme format that acknowledges the existence of the competing information, and as such, it is the only format suited for the complexity of our world. So it actually ends with a joke about the idea that this meme is the only one that's actually engaging in a back and forth about the substance of ideas. Haha. I found it funny. Probably went over a lot of people's heads. That's okay. Now, before I leave memes, I want to give you some 5 simple rules or thoughts about memes. First of all, memes always require audience participation to succeed, whether it be funny or serious or to make an argument or to make people make you think or laugh. This is why when older adults, people I knew when I was a kid growing up, who typically have a more conservative leaning than me, sometimes share memes with me in a fashion that they fail to understand that if I don't accept or at least understand what that thing that's being left out is, then them sharing it with me doesn't have the impact they think it does. So again, they can fall upon deaf ears or blind eyes, whatever you want. Memes do not equal truth. This is another problem I oftentimes have with people who use them too much. I have no problem with people using them to be funny, but when people use them to try and make arguments, I find them to be stilted and kind of pathetic. Because what a meme is at best is it's not a truth. The people try to treat it like a drop mic or a mic drop, sorry. They are at best a claim or an argument. They're at best a thesis. They're the starting point of an argument. They're not the end point. They're not a slam dunk. Okay? Memes like enthymemes take the form of a logical syllogism. They do not actually stand up to the testing of fallacies, nor were they meant to. So they're not meant to be rigorously challenged in a logical format. Okay? That's not their purpose. They're not meant to. They can't do that. Memes are a powerful form of visual communication. They are visual rhetoric, not unlike comic books and other forms of signs, forms of symbols and signs, such as symbiotics. We'll briefly touch about that one. And then memes rely heavily on tropes and stereotypes found in society or group of people, age, race, gender, etc. They can vary or change based on where and who in the world is viewing them or creating them. So it's a very subjective, oftentimes limited audience form of communication because, again, like I said, it's relying on stereotypes and tropes, and because most of the time people don't know how to use them correctly. Now let's briefly touch on symbiotics. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is another form of visual rhetoric, but this one gets a little complex. Symbiotics is what is known as the investigation into how meaning is created and how meaning is communicated. Its origins lie in the academic study of how signs and symbols, visual and linguistic, create meaning. Now it's defined in really a couple different forms, but the main theories basically stem back to the Swiss linguist Fernand Saussure as a study of the life of signs within society. Although the word was used in this sense in the 17th century, by the time of the English philosopher John Locke, the idea of symbiotics as an interdisciplinary mode of examination of the phenomena in different fields emerged in the late 19th and 20th century. With the independent work of Saussure and the American philosopher Charles Sanders Peirce. So these are the two schools of thought. There's a lovely little introduction. It's a little short book told through visual format that actually tries to explain symbiotics. But it can get rather complex. But let me simplify it for what you should take away and understand about it. Let's use these two examples here. It's a study basically of the use of signs and symbols and their meanings. Best explained by example. This is a stop sign. It is a physical sign or representation of an idea, a larger symbolic idea that one must stop when driving in order to create and regulate order among drivers on the road. Now, I bet you don't think about that. You see the stop sign and you respond to it, but the reason you're responding to it is because you've been conditioned by the fact that it's a rule of a symbolic idea of order and regulation designed to help the flow of traffic. Okay, but all you see is a stop sign. So that's the thing, is that a sign is a physical representation of some sort of larger, often more abstract or complex idea. How about this one? You guys know this is the Superman S. What does that stand for? Okay, if you think about the more recent Man of Steel movie, it's supposed to stand for hope. But people recognize this symbol. They know it's Superman. They don't even have to question it. But there's some questions to think about. What is it? What is it? And what does it mean? Okay, that can be many different things to many different people. Typically, though, it does stem back to an idea typically found in the character of Superman, okay, which is the idea of a superhero doing good, saving people. Whatever the variations, that's the sort of default back to. Now, of course, we have some other forms of visual rhetoric, and McLeod talks a little about this. Advertising. Advertising is a very prominent way that you're exposed to visual rhetoric on a daily basis. The idea of using particularly visuals to sell products, using images. Here's an example. Okay. Apparently this person really likes Pepsi because the straw really didn't want to go into this can. And though you do not see the symbol or the label, I think we all know what can this is. Coke. Notice he didn't say that, but if you think about the red and white color scheme, we know what that is. Visual arts. Forms such as ceramics, drawing, painting, sculptures, paint making, design, crafts, photography, video, filmmaking, and architecture. Those are all forms that can be counted with inside visual rhetoric. Here's a nice little example of that. And graffiti. Is writing or drawing made is basically what this is what graffiti is on a wall or other surface used usually without permission. And here's a lovely example of one of the works of Banky. In fact, I believe this is the one that got shredded. It was a lovely little stage episode. I think it got bought at an auction, and then it was immediately the frame it was in shredded it as a protest movement. All right. I hope that has given you a little window into the world of visual rhetoric. I hope it will be useful and helpful to you. And if anybody has further questions or ideas or anything they want to bring up, please don't hesitate to contact me. I always enjoy talking about it. Thank you for your time.